Greetings, listeners, and welcome to episode 76 of the Bladeology podcast. Today, I'm going to be sitting down with Chris from 29 Knives, who is a custom bally song maker and somewhat local to our current location. So I'm hoping to make this a regular segment with Chris going over his lengthy career making bally songs, collecting bally songs, stories about the knife industry, stories about knives in general. This is the first episode of the segment, which I'm going to call 29 Questions. I hope you enjoy. There is a great deal of awesome vintage stories and knowledge to be trapped inside each episode and unwrapped by you. So please enjoy. Stay tuned for more episodes and again, more of this particular segment with Chris. Thanks so much. Let's jump into this like we do every week. Welcome to another episode of the Bladeology podcast. I am your host, Jeremiah Burbank from PVK, and this is episode 1 of 29 Questions. Let's get started. So tell me, you've been a knife maker pretty much your entire life, but how did you get started into it? What did the first year of your career look like? How did you get into making bally songs?
Well, to be honest, it kind of goes further back than that. I first became interested in bally song knives in 1985. So I was actually looking to buy some throwing stars. So I picked up this martial arts magazine. They had some ads in it for throwing stars and got it home. So I'm looking through it some more. I started noticing numerous ads for bally song knives and a book about bally song knives called the Bally Song Manual by Jeff Amata. So shortly after that, I bought a bally song and played around with it a little bit. But it wouldn't really be until late 1987 that I would really get into collecting them, just because I had more money at the time. So this was shortly after Pacific Cutlery went bankrupt and reemerged as the Benchmade Knife Company. So they had 2 new production models out at the time, and I was wanting to get a Pacific Cutlery bally song for a while. The knife that I was carrying was having some issues with the latch coming undone, so I figured, well, it's kind of a safety hazard. Time to upgrade. I've got some money. So I went in and bought one of those knives, and then I bought the other model. And then by the spring of 1988, I was actively buying Benchmade custom bally songs. So around this time, I also bought both of Jeff Amata's books and his videotape. And so these things had photographs and film footage of the Pacific Cutlery workshop. So I became interested in how the knives were made and actually thought it would be cool to work at Benchmade making bally song knives. But I didn't actually think this was something I could do. Benchmade was on the other side of the country, and I was just some kid still in high school. So it was just something I thought would be cool to do, but I wouldn't actually be doing it, kind of a thing. So I was actually seriously thinking. I had a little bit of experience doing some basic knife making projects starting in 1985. I had made a small number of throwing stars and some throwing spikes and a one not particularly impressive throwing knife. So something I thought would be fun to do would be to set up a small workshop and make some really nice high-end throwing stars that were on the same level of quality and finish as the various custom knives I was looking at. So anyways, now fast forward to it's 1997. Now I'm buying my what would end up being my last Benchmade custom Bali song. So this was a custom order. It was ordered a couple of years earlier, so it would take about 2 years and actually a little bit of arm twisting to get this knife. So at this point in time, Jody Sampson had already left Benchmade a little while back. Now the guy that I was dealing with in regards to this knife, now he was gone. So I wound up talking to Roberta Diasis and told her I had this knife on order. And she offers to just refund my deposit. She said they weren't making them anymore, making the knives anymore. They weren't that profitable. They didn't have anyone on hand to grind the blades. So that was basically it for those knives. Although she did later mention that they may try to get into making, maybe get a few done with some well-known knife makers. So later on, they did do some with Adeline Elishewitz and Pat Crawford. I don't know if there were any other people involved, but so that's basically it. So I was able to get her to put this knife together for me. It was basically made with leftover and discarded parts pretty much. So she got the knife together for me and shipped it. So,
So when you're talking about calling Benchmade, you're saying that like back in the day when you're doing this before you started, so you would just call Benchmade and you would either talk to Roberta or Les directly.
Yeah, if you call Benchmade, there was a 50% chance Les Diasis would pick up the phone. Around this time, he usually did pick up the phone, but Roberta, I wound up talking to Roberta about this last knife. So I do remember jokingly saying to her that, and I was joking, I wasn't serious. I said, well, I guess I'll just have to start making them myself. And her reply was basically like, well, good luck. And so that was it. So about a year later, I was now actively making these high-end throwing stars I had spent the past 10 years thinking about making. So I did this for about a year, and then I thought, maybe I'd try my hand at making a Bali song. I had been thinking for a while it might be kind of fun to make a Filipino-style Bali song. I thought they were kind of cool, and they were hard to come by because of the import ban. So I made this one pretty crude Filipino-style Bali song. It's kind of a cross between a Filipino knife and a Benchmade knife. So I showed the knife to my friend who worked at a bicycle frame company. So then we began talking about the idea of making a Benchmade style knife with milled one-piece stainless steel handles. So he explained to me that there was a machine. It turned out it was a milling machine. He didn't know that's what it was. He said there was a machine at the shop that they used to cut slots into bicycle tubes, and that maybe it could be set up to cut a slot in a steel bar that could be used to make a one-piece Bali song handle. So he got us set up with a machine on a Saturday, and I brought in some steel and brought in a couple of end mills. And so we machined. Ultimately, he did most of the work. He ultimately took 4 steel bars and cut channels into them. And then I took those bars and finished them up into knives. He kept one. I kept the other. So at this point in time, I decided I wanted to keep making knives. So this head machinist helped me pick out a milling machine. So I bought a milling machine, got a grinder, and just started making prototype after prototype, just getting more and more equipment. And I thought it would, maybe I'd try putting these on the market once I was able to make what I thought was a sellable product. So it was it was about 2 years later that I began to start selling the knives. It's actually December of 2001. I put 2 knives up for sale at a knife shop in San Francisco. It was a consignment sale. I actually had a coworker order a knife a few months earlier, but he never took delivery of the knife. So that might have been the first order. But the first knives to really go public were those two that went up for sale in San Francisco. And then a couple months later, I got to work on putting together the Blade magazine ad and the initially it was a brochure, and then later the brochure was made into a website. So it was early 2002 that things really took off, and so I've been just routinely just making the knives off and on since that time.
Okay, all right. I mean, that's a pretty outstanding start to the whole process. What can I ask? What was the name of the shop in San Francisco? Is that still there?
I'm not sure if it's still there. I went online maybe a couple of years ago, and I think they were still there at the time. They were called We Be Knives. They were located on, I think it was the pier where they had a lot of different shops. It was a small little shop, but almost like a hole in the wall. But it was a nice little shop. They had a lot of nice stuff.
So yeah, so we be still there. I've visited them. I went to San Francisco to see Tad, and then I looked them up. They are online, but they are still there. I think they've changed ownership since definitely when you were there. They've changed ownership. But Derek, the current owner, pretty cool. It's a small shop on the pier. It's a pretty neat little location for a knife shop. I think they get a lot of foot traffic there. So you put them on consignment. Whatever happened to they eventually sold inevitably.
Yeah, they took about 4 months to sell. They sold sometime in March, so this was I had already been getting some orders.
And now when you're saying you were sort of getting orders, you're talking about like from the forums?
The magazine ad is probably what got it going and got me into the public eye. At the time, I wasn't internet savvy. I didn't know anything about like going on the internet, going on forums. I didn't know the forums even existed. Just everything I knew about the knife scene I got from the knife magazines at the time. But I think somebody on the forums saw the ad. It kind of started to spread like wildfire on the forums. So I think most people that contact me were people on the forums. I did get a small number of orders from people here and there who I think they just saw the magazine ad and contacted me and placed an order.
So tell me about this magazine ad. What was the magazine that you put the ad in?
It was Blade magazine. It was just a small, basic ad, nothing too fancy.
Okay. It must have had your iconic 29 logo, I would imagine.
Yeah, it did. Getting people to do the logo for some reason has always been a problem. But yeah, it had the logo, if I remember correctly, and it had the first ad had a image of a Bali song with a crisp blade, and then later I sent them another knife and did a slightly different ad. So I think it was ultimately just 2 different ads, and that ran for, I don't know, maybe a year or so, and then eventually pulled it.
Do you remember what year that was that you ran that in Blade magazine?
The first ad appeared in early 2001. Might have been like a January or February issue, something like that, maybe a March issue.
Okay. Definitely gonna try to track down a back issue of that.
Yeah, I think I still have all those issues because I was given a free subscription to Blade magazine as an advertiser.
Bonus. Okay. Free subscription. So
yeah.
you'd been a reader of Blade magazine previously.
Yeah.
So where did you come across your first issue of Blade magazine, out of curiosity?
Good question. I'm not 100% sure. I think I first heard of Blade magazine actually. It was mentioned in Jeff Amata's book, The Blog Song Manual, because Les D'Assis won the Blade magazine award of the year. So I think that might be where I first heard of him. And I assume back in the 80s I must have seen the magazine at stores. I do remember buying one magazine. It was something else. I think it was called Fighting Knives, which was around in the 80s. This issue had a interview with Les D'Assis.
So Fighting Knives, that must have been previous to Tactical Knives?
Possibly.
Okay. So, all right. So we're here. Let's go back a little bit. So, in the beginning, where did you first put your hands on a Bali song?
I was at there's a little shop down the street called This and That. So Yeah, so I remember they had a few. They sold all kinds of things, like consumer electronics, dartboards, you name it. I guess it was kind of like a pawn shop. I don't know if it actually was one, but they had a little display of various knives, and I think they had at least a couple of knives. So yeah, they said I had to have a note from my mother to buy the knife, so I wrote a fake note and brought it in, and the lady agreed to sell it to me. So it was a knife called a Dragon Lock. It was a full size knife, and not bad for a starter Bali song. Cost about $25.
That's not bad. Okay, I like that. Forging the doctor's note. Absolutely. Okay. Um, so the Benchmade thing, it's such a crucial part of your story because it's a pivoting inspirational point for a lot of your designs. I would say. So let's dive into that a little bit. Like, how did you find a Benchmade knife? How would you even figure out how to contact Les? How did you even find out about the Amada handbook? Like, what are the real, where was your first introduction to some of this stuff?
Well, it was the that martial arts magazine. It had ads in it, at least one ad for the Bali Song manual. And then there was one Pacific Cutlery had an ad of their own in the magazine. It was a pretty good size ad. Might have taken up either half a page or the whole page. They were advertising the Model 10. And then there was numerous ads with just various dealers that showed like lots of different makes models of Bali songs. But it was very clear right from looking at that magazine that the Pacific Cutlery knives were the best. I mean, they did a pretty good job of showing that. They're the only ones that had a pretty much like either a full size or a half size ad. I actually think I still have that ad somewhere, just cut out of the magazine. So it's pretty. And the Jeff Amada's books and his videotape did a pretty good job convincing you that those were the knives. It seems like most of the other knives seem to mostly be kind of junk. The Taylor Manila folders looked pretty good. I was never able to get a hold of one. Every place I had them, you had to be 18. Then I'd get somebody to buy one for me, and it would be gone. So kind of gave up on that. Those seemed pretty decent. There was the Golden Dragon series. Those seemed pretty decent. I mean, I guess as long as the knife is made with steel and brass or even aluminum, it's somewhat decent. The die-cast metal knives are probably the worst. A lot of those knives could have been, they might have had decent materials, but not the best execution. A lot of them, for some reason, they couldn't really lock properly. Things like that.
So and this is in the 80s, and you're sort of at a younger age at that point. What did the knife scene look like then? Like, you're talking about there was multiple people making Bali songs. Like, give me a picture of just how cool Bali songs were at that point in time. Like the ninja aesthetic, the movie aesthetic, the cool aesthetic. These were at the time cool for so many reasons beyond just being a knife, right?
Yeah, I suppose. They were pretty flashy. The thing is, if you wanted a fast action knife, a knife that you could open quickly with one hand, I mean, if you just wanted to walk into a local store in the Boston area and get a knife that you could quickly open with one hand, it seems like that's all that there was. Switchblades were out of the question. Nobody was selling those because these stores, they want to stay on the right side of the law. It seemed like most of the other knives in the stores were either various slip joint knives, jackknives, Swiss Army knives, and then it seemed like a lot of these buck knives, lockback folders. Apparently, liner locks did exist at that time, but I don't know if I ever saw one. Maybe I was looking at one and didn't know what I was looking at, but didn't know anything of like the various knives that later became popular, like the Emerson knives, where you would have like a thumb disc and you could just take your thumb and thumb the knife open. There just didn't seem to be anything else on the market other than a Bali song. And also from Jeff Amada's books, it sounded like a switchblade. It wasn't just a knife that opened by means of pushing a button and having a spring open the blade. In the eyes of the law, any knife that could be opened just by a flick of the wrist or by gravity was considered a switchblade and illegal, but that the Balisong kind of got around that because even though you could open it quickly like a switchblade, it did take some skill, so it wasn't like anyone could do it. So, yeah, it just seemed like the Balisong was the only fast action knife available at the time. The big question for me was, could the knife be opened like a switchblade? I actually wanted a switchblade, but couldn't get one. So I thought, well, maybe the Balisong could be operated like a switchblade. And, I was kind of interested in how they were, the fancy opening techniques. But for me, the big thing was, can it be made to work like a switchblade? If it can, then it's a pretty valid design.
Okay, so fast action knife, one hand opening knife. These are totally practical tool reasons to have a pocket knife. So a Balisong by any means, not necessarily at that point was like sort of a, like we look at flipping culture now, right? Like on Instagram and YouTube, and there are these guys like flipping knives for hours and hours. But originally you were looking at this as a totally practical, like a tool, sort of a one hand opening knife for quick action, which is completely different than how we look at knives now, especially in the Balisong community. It's sort of, I guess we generally call them just flippers in general. But the appeal here was more practical than anything else.
Yeah, I think so. I became interested in how the fancier opening techniques. I couldn't really figure out Jeff Mata's books as far as how to do all these flipping techniques. But once I got his videotape, it really opened up my eyes. It was much easier to follow the instructions with the videotape. So I got into flipping them around and pretty much mastered all the techniques in his videotape. So that was cool. But yeah, I wanted to see if the knife could be a like a useful, practical knife, and it seemed to be. And the other thing was Les Assis basically marketed the knife as he claimed it was the strongest folding knife available, which maybe he was right about that. He did explain how each handle was made from a singular bar of steel. There was nothing to break, chip off, come off, or anything. It was just a singular bar of metal. And he also described it as having a 3-point locking system. And I was pretty much sold on what he said. The knives did look pretty solid. It was just, you just had 2 metal bars for the handles, and that was it. The buck knives had lots of little pieces. I did finally get my hands on an Italian stiletto type switchblade, and noticed that it was like just lots of little bits and pieces of metal. So I was convinced that Les was right, that it was a pretty solid knife. And the other thing was that they did make the sales pitch that the knife offered optimum blade protection, which is true, especially with the one-piece handle. There, your blade's completely covered, so you could have it like in a pocket with a bunch of coins rolling around with a knife, and that's not going to contact the blade. You could throw the knife in a toolbox, and the blade's going to be protected.
I mean, those are all totally logical reasons, especially just for a pocket knife. I mean, it's absolutely right. I've never even thought about the simple practicality involved there, which is when the handles are closed around the blade. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously totally safe. And when the lock is engaged, for practical purposes, right, throw it in the glove box, totally safe. It's not going to accidentally open. It's not going to misfire. The only way it can fire is if you physically engage the flipping mechanism, which is not really a mechanism. It's just pins, or whatever, screws, pivots. No, that's very practical. So when we started down this path, we're talking about Pacific Cutlery, right? So Pacific Cutlery was the inception before Benchmade. So when you started these Pacific Cutlery ads, used the butterfly and the Bally Dash song logo, or this was even pre a lot of that, right?
Now, the Pacific Cutlery ads had the Balisong logo with the butterfly and the Bali Dash song.
Okay.
So the original company, I assume you know this, was actually called Bali Song Inc. I think so. At the time, I think they were just making Bali Song knives, and then at some point in time, they changed the name to Pacific Cutlery and branched out into making other types of knives. But I believe the Bali Song logo is always there.
Right. So, at what point in those those early days, do you remember when it changed? Because I don't. The exact date it changed from Pacific Cutlery to Benchmade, or what era that was?
I can give you a era. So
Yeah.
Pacific Cutlery went bankrupt in 1987. This was actually that magazine I got. Les Dassis does talk about what happened. So, as far as I know, they went out of business in, I believe it was maybe the spring of 1987. I'm not 100% sure, but it was sometime in 87 that they went bankrupt. And then a little while after that, not really sure when, they did reemerge as the Benchmade Knife Company. So it was around Christmas time, 1987, that there was a knife shop called Stoddard's that stocked their knives. And so that's when I went in to buy one. And that's when I heard, they told me that Pacific Cutlery was gone. It went out of business, and that there was this new company called Benchmade, and they had the same machines and were making the knives again. They didn't say anything about it being under the same ownership or anything. I didn't know who Les Dassis was at the time, so I just kind of assumed the way they talked that somebody came along and bought up their equipment and started this new company called Benchmade. So Benchmade came about in late 1987.
Okay. What was the first time you called Les, and why?
Well, I actually spoke to Les on the phone before I ever actually tried to call him. I ordered a Benchmade custom Bali Song in the spring of 1988 through Stoddard's, and it actually had a mechanical problem. So I brought it back to the store, and they sent it back to Benchmade. The knife came back, and it still had this mechanical issue. So the salesman called Benchmade and got Les, and then the salesman put me on the phone with Les, and I explained to him what the problem was. So that was the first time I spoke to him, and then I started calling Benchmade later that year, in the fall, asking for catalogs, and so there'd be different people that would answer, but it seemed like half the time Les would pick up the phone.
Wow. Okay. I mean, that's so cool, obviously, for so many reasons, just because that obviously Benchmade would go from those days where you would talk to them to Benchmade that we all know now. Obviously, unfortunately, it totally changed company, still family owned. Les passed away, but I mean, it's a massive quasi conglomerate now. You certainly couldn't call now and talk to any of those people. You can't call and talk to anybody. It's just online only. So it's really neat to hear, you reaching out to one of these companies pre current era and just talking to the owner. The owner would just pick up, just say, hey, how's it going? How can I help? What was, out of curiosity, what was the solution for the mechanical problem at Stoddard's? What was it, a latch issue, or do you remember?
Well, it turns out the problem with this knife was the problem I was having with the knife is it would lock. Sometimes it would lock tightly in the open position, and other times it wouldn't lock at all, and the latch would just fall off. So it turns out, now that this makes sense, they said the bushing was warped. So it sounds like it must have meant that the hole in the bushing was off center. And so they took the knife apart and discovered this. And ultimately, they just sent me an entirely new knife.
That's pretty good. That's not bad. Okay. So give me when you're at Stoddard's, right? You're in Stoddard's. Just for sort of reference as far as knife industry stuff goes, what else was in the case at Stoddard's? I mean, Stoddard's was a knife shop. Something like we haven't seen until really recently in the last 5 years. We've seen an explosion of more brick and mortar knife shops. But back then, like, what did Stoddard's have? Like, they did case knives, Swiss Army knives, obviously. Like,
Yeah, I think pretty much all of that. I think most of the types of knives that were on the market at the time you could find at Stoddard's. They actually had 3 stores. I went to 2 of them. There was one that never got to. It was far away. That was in Chestnut Hill, which not even quite sure where that is. But the other 2, the one I mostly went to was called. It was at I think it was called Temple Place, right near the Boston Common, and then the other one was in Copley Plaza. So Copley Plaza seemed to have more high-end custom knives for sale. The guy was kind of a snob too. He actually did not like butterfly knives. So the starters at Temple Place was different. You know, they sold butterfly knives. It was just Benchmade Pacific Cutlery, and then later Benchmade butterfly knives. That's how they sold. You know, they sold quality stuff. So I went to the store at Copley Plaza, and I asked them if they sold Bali songs. You know, I think I was looking for Pacific Cutlery stuff because everything else was pretty lame for the most part. So the guy just kind of snaps back. He goes, "No, we do not sell butterfly knives. I don't like the social types that they attract, and I don't like Pacific Cutlery. They're overrated."
wow. Okay. Wow. All right.
Yeah, the funny thing is, many years later, this knife maker, Paul Jarvis, had some of his art Bali songs for sale at that same store, and that same guy comes over and he's like, "That one's a stunner, isn't it?" So he liked those, but he didn't like the Pacific Cutlery knives. So,
I mean, okay, that's a good, but I mean, that tails to what we were talking about before. So like in that time period, these were exterior, outside, like, knife people. These were seen as, like, you know, dangerous weapons kind of thing, like leather jacket wearing, you know, like the classic sort of switchblade. Like, that's what people probably thought of when they saw Bali songs, right? That was the connotation. He was like, "Oh, I don't like these social types with the Bali songs." So it took a while for Bali songs to sort of gain acceptance, you know, in culture, if you can say they're accepted now, and certainly in the knife industry. I think they're still, you know, there was a period of time where acceptance needed to happen, you know, before the Bali song craze.
yeah, I think they did have a little bit of a negative connotation at the time. Probably it did appear in a lot of movies and TV shows. And actually, in the Advanced Bali Song Manual, that was Jeff Mata's second book, there is some, and Jeff Mata did give the knife some publicity in, I believe, maybe both movies and TV. And there was a little bit in the front saying that Jeff Mata might have done his job too well, showing the knife in various films, that Bali songs did appear overly lethal and menacing, and that might have caused some of the problems that happened, because the Bali song was banned from importation around that time frame. So yeah, there was some people who did look at the knife as more just a weapon, and I assume there's probably still people that kind of look at them that way. But
I mean, we struggle with that as a community and an industry as a whole. People are like, "Oh, these knives they're dangerous weapons," and of course, we just see them as either art pieces or, you know, practical tools to have in our pocket for everyday cutting tasks. So I mean, I think that's always a social, which is probably it's on all of us to sort of expand everyone's ideas to a certain extent when it comes to knives. It's like, look, this is not a weapon. This is, you know, it's a functional piece of art that it happens to also be a tool, or it's a tool that also happens to be a functional piece of art.
Well, that's the thing. Jeff Mata did. He did make some efforts, and like his books mentioned some, a little bit that the Bali song clearly had uses other than as a weapon. And in his videotape, he did show that it was a little section called "Everyday Uses of the Bali song." So he did try to demonstrate that the knife could be a useful tool.
So that it's funny though that the guy at Stoddard's years later would have to eat humble pie when it came to ballet songs.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of funny. It might have had a point about Pacific Cutlery maybe being a little overrated. Their unfortunately, the quality control wasn't always up to par, and he was mentioning that he had some very nice looking custom knives in the case, including a couple of beautiful daggers, and just kind of pointing out like the higher quality workmanship of those knives compared to the Pacific Cutlery knives. It's like, yeah, they can't do something like this. So I've had a couple points, but yeah, I'm not really sure why he was so down on them. I mean, they did for the most part make pretty good quality, serious Bali songs. But yeah, I think they were might have been a little more attractive to kids, younger people, than like other types of knives, and so maybe he wouldn't want to have Bali songs in the store because it'd be like a bunch of kids coming to look at them. Apparently, according to the article in Knife Magazine, the interview with Lester Assis, there's some statement that Bali songs got a bad rap in the 80s when companies like Taylor started importing really cheap knives, and kids could buy them with, just like a few days lunch money, and they started showing up on playgrounds. So they do say that hurt them.
It's an interesting argument, the financial angle to the expansion of a product's. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, at a point, and out of curiosity, so I mean, we're talking about, so there are some off the shelf, literally off Stoddard's shelves, ballet songs by Benchmade and Pacific Cutlery. Back then, what would be the retail for like a Model 10 or what have you from Stoddard's?
Well, the main knives that I was seeing at Stoddard's, because this was when Benchmade started, they had Benchmade offered the Model 30 and 35. Stoddard's sold both of those knives. So the Model 30 was $60, the 35 was $75. So they're basically the same knife. The 35 was just a little bit more finished. It had countersunk holes and the pins were hidden, whereas the other knife, the pins were exposed. They weren't. It's basically what you would have before you would do the next process of grinding the pins down and blending them, and the holes were not countersunk.
Okay. So that would be considered just like a regular production ballet song like you get from Stoddard's. But then there's also sort of, we were talking about this earlier, this idea of like a custom ordered ballet song, which you would get either from a dealer or in this case, they wanted you to go directly to Benchmade. Tell me a little bit about like a custom order ballet song back then. Sort of what would be the difference between a production and a custom?
As far as the how it was made, the features and construction.
For instance, like back then, how are these knives ground? I mean, I guess that's a question. We talk about this a lot. How are these knives ground? But I mean, these are like the finishing. What are the finishing and material and grind differences between a production and a custom back then anyway? Like what was the custom that you originally ordered? What was that?
Well, I can explain the differences. The first noticeable difference was that the customs, the typical customs, had thicker blade stock and thicker handles. Also, the handles on the customs were milled from metal bars. Typically, at the time, it was 303 stainless steel, but they did make some other things with aluminum or brass, but they were all milled from metal bars, and they were generally thicker. The production models, like the 30 and 35, the handles, they were stainless steel, but they were investment cast stainless steel handles. And I assume the blades, I'm not quite sure how they were making them. Maybe they were stamped or something. And I assume they were machine ground. But Also, the Model 30 and 35, those knives were smaller knives, whereas the customs they either had blades that were just over 4 inches long or 5 inches. Apparently, there were some customs that were shorter that I think were still thick, but had shorter blades. And there might have been some other oddball things. But the typical custom was a full-size knife or a large knife, 4 or 5 inch, and thicker blades, thicker handles, but blades were hand ground. And during the Pacific Cutlery era, apparently they did have some full-size production knives, and then later on they introduced some full-size production knives. This is like before the Model 42 era.
So really, the smaller size bally songs were always a little more popular for carry and for use. Like that's more of what you saw at Stoddard's, were the smaller ones that you were talking about.
Yeah, I would assume so. There's also a large price difference too. So
what would we be looking at for a custom, out of curiosity?
I believe, Stoddard's had a few customs at the time that were left over from the Pacific Cutlery era. So they started at $275 for a skeleton knife with a 4-inch blade. And
so, I mean, that's a considerable price difference.
Yeah, that is. Now, I remember I got the Benchmade price list in the fall of 1988. So their price was, I think it was like $325 for a 4-inch model with skeleton handles. So, yeah, definitely a big price difference.
I mean, especially if you can give me just a little bit of context as far as finances go. The year is like, how much was gas back then? Like that was considered a fair amount of money for a knife. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know what gas cost. I wasn't driving or anything,
yeah.
But I mean,
yeah,
it was a lot of money for a knife.
Yeah. Okay. Like that would be a considerable upgrade. So at Stoddard's, they had some of these customs left over from Pacific Cutlery, but you also mentioned they had other custom knives there at that point, or that was later?
I think it was the store at Copley Plaza had more custom knives. I think the one at Temple Place was probably just more factory knives. The only customs I can really think of are those Pacific Cutlery customs, and then I do remember they had this fancy cold steel Tonto knife. It was like some kind of special edition. I think it was like $600. And it had a looked like it was a Damascus steel blade.
Oh wow. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So that was in a separate case, and kind of right next to it, sort of lurking in the shadows, was this extra custom volley song. And so I remember looking over in that case, and I said, what's with this knife? You know, it's kind of, why is it not with the other custom volley songs? So the guy pulled it out, and this knife was $550 and had a Damascus steel blade.
Who made that? Do you remember?
Huh?
Who made that?
That was a Pacific Cutlery custom.
All right. I wonder what kind of Damascus that was back then. God only knows.
Yep, that's it. God only knows. I think somebody said there was some company called Damascus USA that sold Damascus steel blanks. I think somebody at the store said it might have been Damascus USA. I have no idea.
So when you ordered this first custom, were you familiar with the sort of the Jody Sampson thing, or that was a new thing to you, and you were like, I want to get a custom and I want it ground by Jody? Or tell me a little bit about your knowledge and incorporation of Jody into the Benchmade story.
I really only recently heard about Jody Sampson, actually just from a magazine ad that was somebody was selling some Benchmade custom volley songs, and they explained that Jody was still working with them grinding the blades. So that's really all I knew about him. So I just wanted to get a Benchmade custom volley song. It really didn't matter who was grinding it. Really didn't know anything about him. I later in the fall of '88, I got a Benchmade catalog. So in the catalog, there was a picture of Jody Sampson at his grinder, And then it did explain that he made the swords for the Conan movies, and mentioned he was associated with I think it was a famous knife maker, something, I mean Nelson Cooper or something like that. So they give a little like a little biography in the sales literature about Jody Sampson.
What was the blade? Did you say what was the blade on the custom order?
The first knife that was a custom-made knife that I ordered had a Chris blade.
Okay, all right. Why that blade? Out of curiosity, just.
I thought it was a pretty cool looking blade. And yeah, they didn't have it in the stores. It was double edged too, so actually it would have been illegal for them to sell. But yeah, I thought it was a pretty cool blade. I'm going to go through the expense and trouble of ordering a custom volley song. Might as well just go for it and get a Chris. So I basically wanted to get most of the blade shapes that they had.
Okay.
So
inlays on the handle or.
That knife was actually a skeleton model. I did actually have a preference for knives with skeleton handles, but I like the knives with the inserts. I eventually wound up getting some of those.
All right. And so that's another good. So the production stuff was all skeleton stuff, right? None of it had inlays?
Yeah, I believe that would be correct. I'm not aware of anything that had inlays.
Okay. That's a good. And this is all blue boxed. The Pacific Cutlery. Do you have any of these? These are all in boxes in your collection?
Actually, I think I only have 2 knives from the Pacific Cutlery era, if I recall correctly. And so one is, that Damascus steel knife I was mentioning.
Oh, you got that one.
Yeah. And then there was another one with stainless steel utility blade. Those knives did not have boxes.
Okay.
Yeah, all those custom volley songs at starters that they had there for sale in the case, they didn't do the best job of keeping things together. They had all been flipped. They had nicks on them. And they didn't, for whatever reason, they didn't have the boxes, if I remember correctly.
So were those like the classic zip pouches we see now, or were those the Benchmade Cocoon, like Velcro pouches?
Yeah, they did come in Cocoon sheaths, but actually those leftover Benchmade Customs, I don't think they even had the sheaths for them.
Wow. Okay.
I remember the first custom was that one with the utility blade, and I think they just gave me something else that they just had laying around. So I think they lost the sheath. There was I got a total of 3. I bought a total of 3 custom volley songs from the Pacific Cutlery era. Unfortunately, one was stolen. That's a long story, but so one was stolen, but I still have the other 2. So yeah, I think the boxes were all gone. But those Model 30s and 35s, like those were current production knives, they're like brand new, fresh from the factory. They came with a Cocoon sheath, which is pretty standard, and they just came in I think kind of a generic box. I think they're called the Indestructo mailers. I think that's what it was. Box you buy, flat, you fold it up, and they just had a little label. It wasn't anything fancy. It was just like, it looked like it was just kind of typed out. I think it just said like Volley Song Knives and a little description. And that's how it was with the Benchmade Customs too. You would just get one of these white boxes, and it would just be a little label describing the knife. There wasn't any like logo or anything like that. Nothing that really said, it might have said Benchmade, might have had Benchmade typed out on the label, but it wasn't like a nice fancy proprietary box. I think they're just buying these boxes from somewhere and just slapping their little typed up label on them.
Makes sense. I mean, yeah, custom knife packaging has always been simple, direct. I mean, it's not a large scale production thing. It's it's more about the knife, I suppose, than the packaging.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the deal was with that packaging, because it looked like during the Pacific Cutlery era, a lot of their knives came in boxes that actually looked like they were actually made for Pacific Cutlery. And yeah, I think they were blue. And I did get a cheap, one of those cheap International Series knives. I can't remember, that might have come in a Pacific Cutlery box, but they did have boxes that actually were like printed boxes that would say Pacific Cutlery. But for whatever reason, at this point in time, they weren't the stuff from the early Benchmade era did not have like a proprietary Benchmade box.
So you ended up getting the very expensive Damascus bladed Balisong.
Yeah, it was just that one.
Out of curiosity, you don't have to tell me. How did you save up for that? Like that seems like a lot of money at
Yeah, it was a lot of money. The dealer gave me a discount. They sold it to me for $450. At that time, I got a food service job, and just for the purpose of buying knives. So I was making about $5 an hour. I was working a little over 20 hours a week, so I was taking home like $120. So I was able to save up for a custom Balisong pretty much in about a 4-week period.
that's not bad.
Yeah, so it wasn't too hard to save up for one of these.
So you were feeding the addiction pretty young. You were like, I gotta have that. I'm getting a job to buy that custom Balisong.
Yeah, how else was I gonna get them? I was gonna like steal them.
That's true. That's true. Okay. All right. No, that's legit. Okay. So you got the Damascus Balisong, and now at this time, so you're building a collection. Like you're buying these knives. You're starting to collect them. As far as flipping goes, where were you at with opening and closing the knives? Was there one Benchmade that you preferred to carry or manipulate over the others?
Yeah, that knife would just be the Model 35. I mean, I'm not going to carry a super expensive custom Balisong. I actually wanted to keep those new, so there was that. They were kind of bulky, but ultimately they were expensive. My friend brought it up. He goes, "What if you lose one of those? That's like a bad deal. That's a lot of money." It's like, yeah, you have a point there. So, yeah, I wasn't going to carry a knife that if I lost it, it was going to be like a big financial loss. So the Model 35 was a pretty good knife. I do think it would have been nice if they had a full-size version, but unfortunately that wasn't available at the time. It seemed to take them a few years. I think they came out with the Model 45 in it was like in the summer of 1991. So yeah, that was a pretty good knife. I'm not sure why they took so long to come out with this full-size knife. But yeah, the Model 35 and the 30, those were really the go-to knives at the time. If you just wanted a good quality Balisong that wasn't too expensive.
So now, just for everybody out there, the model that you're talking about, this is the classic hole pattern Benchmade, 2 1 2 1 2 1, etc.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a name for that dot pattern? I just call it the Benchmade dot pattern. It's like the super traditional, what I think of. Do you call that something else?
I don't. They just call them skeleton handles. When I first started making knives, initially I did not include the 2 holes just because at the time it seemed like it would just added more time to the build and I'd have to charge more, and wasn't quite sure how to go about doing it with the materials I was using. So I put the idea of using the twin holes on a back burner and initially offered the knives with just the larger countersunk holes, which is also what appeared on like the Taylor Manila folder. And also Pacific Cutlery had a knife which actually appears to, some of the Manila folders actually were made with die-cast metal handles, not the brass or the aluminum. And Pacific Cutlery had a knife that they introduced briefly called the 129, and that looks identical to those die-cast metal Manila folders. So I actually think that they were both made by the same company, same manufacturer, and they were just, some of them went out with a Pacific Cutlery logo and others went out with a Manila folder logo. That's what I'm kind of assuming. So those knives, they looked a lot like the full-size customs, but they did not have the twin holes. They just had the larger countersunk holes. So initially I just went with that pattern, just larger countersunk holes. That would be nice, kind of do something a little bit different anyway, and you'll see it'll be easier to do, and it was a way to keep the price down. And then I don't know, maybe it was around 2004, I started making some with the twin holes. So for a while, I actually offered both types. So you could, there would be two different price points. So for a period of time, I called those the deluxe skeleton handles because they had the twin holes. But I finally decided to just discontinue the original skeleton handles I was doing. So those I just call them skeleton handles now. So I don't think they ever had any particular name for that handle design. They just called them skeleton handles. They did have the slotted skeleton handles on the International Series knives, and then that was in the Pacific Cutlery era. And then when they were Benchmade, they reintroduced those, but slightly different, but the same. They kept the same skeleton pattern, and I thought it was a cool pattern. I don't really understand why they didn't offer those in like a higher quality format. I mean, either in the investment cast stainless steel format or in the custom Bali song format with the handles being milled from solid metal bars. So they were always just it was just those cheap knives with cast metal handles that had the slotted pattern.
Yeah, the red box Benchmade was such a strange. I mean, I guess I think a lot of people look back on that as like a somewhat of a misstep. Just like the whole international idea. Of course, now we have knives from China all over the place, but back then certainly that was a different case. So I mean, tell me a little bit about, like, did you have red box Benchmade Bally songs, or do you still have any now?
The only low end, I got a Pacific Cutlery International Series knife. Well, I think it was ultimately two of those. There was a Model 129. To be honest, I don't even remember what kind of box that came in. I think it was actually in some kind of a silver wrapper or something. I don't know what the deal was with those exactly. Those didn't really go. Those were just made in a limited batch. According to Jeff Mata's books, the second book, that knife, it didn't meet Pacific Cutlery's standards, so they originally rejected they're going to reject the shipment, but some orders had already been placed, so they agreed to ship out those knives. Now, the International Series knives, I got one of those. It seemed like a lesser knife than the Model 129, and they had those were kind of a regular item of theirs. I think it might have come in a Pacific Cutlery marked box. I can't remember what color it was. I definitely don't remember a red box. It might have been a blue box. I'm not sure. That was a long time ago. I think it did come in a Pacific Cutlery box. And then there were I got a couple of the they were sort of like the reintroduction of those same International Series knives from Benchmade. The blades were different though. They were mirror polished. And so I can't really remember what kind of box those came in. They might have just come in that white cardboard box. It's so long ago, I can't really remember.
I didn't even realize the Pacific Cutlery had an international series. I thought that was only Benchmade that had an international series. Because I remember red box Benchmades. We had those way back when, and those were the ones the imported versions came in red, the regular production came in blue, and then the automatics came in a black box. So I wasn't even aware that Pacific Cutlery. So that's cool. I didn't catch on to that. But I guess they were of low standards. So.
Yeah, I don't think Bali songs were banned from importation by the time that Benchmade came about. So Benchmade really couldn't have had an international series.
Well,
legally,
they had like folders. The folders.
Well, maybe folders, but as far as like Bali songs,
yeah.
And so apparently, according to that article, that was part of what led to Pacific Cutlery's demise, was that they had the international series, which they were selling. Sound like they sold okay, and they were somewhat dependent on that line of knives. And then the U.S. Customs, they reversed their decision on the legal status of butterfly knives. And so now they lost the international series just like that, and that contributed to their problems.
Now, the customs thing, what was your that? I mean, as far as I remember, that had a lot to do with Spyderco and the Spiderfly being imported, and the importation. And the Spiderfly said it was made in the USA when it was imported. Do you remember know anything about was Benchmade?
Yeah, I heard a little bit about the issue with Spyderco. So I don't know much about it. I guess apparently some of the parts are being made offshores, and that was kind of an issue with customs.
Did you ever put your hands on a regular Spiderfly, the full size, when they were in production?
Yeah, I did actually get one.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a neat knife. It's like very strange knife.
Yeah, definitely strange, but yeah, I guess it was a neat knife.
Yeah, it was a cool one.
Yeah, it was nice to see some other companies introducing like quality Bali songs. So it seems like it was probably one of the earlier quality non-benchmade Bali songs on the market. So.
And so the Schrade or the Taylor Manila folder, that kind of came and went. You said you didn't get your hands on one of those originally, but I'm sure you probably have one now.
No, I never really got one. It seemed like a good quality knife from the way it was described in the Advanced Bali Song Manual. It had a lot of them had brass handles that were milled from brass bars, and then there were some that had aluminum handles. Some of them had inserts, which is pretty nice, and then others had skeleton handles. So I did see some in. It was just a couple of knife shops that had them, but the problem was that you had to be 18 to buy a knife, and I wasn't 18 at the time. So yeah, there was one knife shop at a mall called Cutlery World. They had one. I went back there with my mother to buy it, but it was sold. Then there was a store, I think it was called Remington Shavers and Knives or something. It's actually pretty much like right around the corner and down the street from Stoddard's. So the lady who worked at Stoddard's agreed to go with me to this store and buy this manila folder for me and walk in, and it was gone. So then Chesapeake Knife and Tool, which was another knife shop nearby in Faneuil Hall, they had some of these leftover imported knives because, at this point in time, the import ban was in effect, so these knives weren't coming in anymore. So there was a limited supply, but they had a fair amount of these imported knives in their store. So I asked them if they could maybe get a manila folder, and so the guy's like, well, we'll see what we can do, maybe make some phone calls. And so I went in there one time, and they're like, yeah, we got the manila folders. And I'm like, all right, great. And it wasn't the manila folder that I had in mind. This was one of the knives that had the die-cast metal handles and was appeared to be identical to the Pacific Cutlery Model 129. So that was the appeal of the original manila folders that I was acquainted with, was that they had milled handles, and the brass ones seemed especially appealing.
It's a good-looking knife with brass handles in a Bali song. There's a certain look to it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, they look good.
I like that. That's pretty sharp. So the lady who worked at the store accompanied you to purchase the knife.
Yeah. I mean, that's the only way I've been able to pull it off would be to get an adult to buy the knife for me. But unfortunately, it had been sold. So that was kind of it with the manila folders. I just never...
So, I mean,
it was a knife that eluded me.
You were going to the store enough to be pretty friendly with the people who worked there to have them help you get a knife.
Yeah, actually, considering how much business I was giving them, that's probably the least that they could have done was help me buy a knife.
All right. I mean, it was good of them to encourage a young patron of the arts and of the craft to acquire more tools. Being a good customer, why not? That's logical. That's logical.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay, I dig it. I think that's pretty good. We hit an hour. That's pretty good for our first one. So, Chris, thanks for sitting down with us, and we'll get you on the next episode.
All right. Nice being here.
Thanks, Chris.